It was a quiet autumn evening in the small town of Oak Ridge, nestled deep in the rolling hills of West Virginia. The town was known for its tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other's business. At least, that was what people liked to believe. On the surface, the residents lived peaceful lives, untouched by the kind of darkness that seemed to plague the rest of the world. But behind closed doors, secrets festered, hidden from prying eyes. On October 15, 2015, one such secret erupted into a horrifying reality when the lifeless body of 35-year-old Abigail Carter was discovered in her home. The town was stunned. Abigail had been well known and well liked. A devoted wife and mother of two, she seemed to have everything anyone could wish for: a loving husband, beautiful children, and a picturesque life in their charming farmhouse. But as the police delved into Abigail's life, they uncovered a web of deceit and betrayal that shattered the town's image of the perfect family. The investigation would reveal a scandalous affair, an illegitimate child, and a murder that rocked Oak Ridge to its core. Abigail had been married to Jonathan Carter for 12 years. Jonathan, a successful local contractor, was the epitome of a family man. He coached his son's little league team, volunteered at the church, and was always seen with a smile. But beneath this facade lay a man with dark desires and a secret life he had carefully concealed. It all began in the summer of 2014, when Jonathan's niece, 19-year-old Emily Harris, came to stay with the Carters. Emily, the daughter of Jonathan's estranged sister, had just graduated high school and was looking for a fresh start after a troubled childhood. Abigail, always generous and kind-hearted, offered Emily a place to stay while she figured out her next steps. Emily was a striking young woman with long auburn hair and a vibrant personality that quickly caught the attention of many in the small town. She was young and full of life, bringing a spark into the Carter household. Abigail treated her like a daughter, but for Jonathan, the lines blurred quickly. What began as an innocent fondness soon turned into something far more dangerous. Jonathan found himself drawn to Emily in a way he had never experienced before. At first, he dismissed his feelings as harmless, just a natural protective instinct for his niece. But as the days turned into weeks, his attraction grew stronger, and it wasn't long before he found excuses to spend more time with her. Small touches, lingering glances, what started as subtle signs of his infatuation soon evolved into something much more sinister. Emily, vulnerable and seeking stability, was flattered by the attention from her uncle. Jonathan was older, experienced, and had an air of authority that made her feel safe. She mistook his advances for genuine affection, believing that he saw something in her that no one else did. It wasn't long before she found herself caught in his web of manipulation. Their affair began quietly, with stolen kisses and whispered confessions late at night when Abigail was asleep and the house was silent. They convinced themselves it was love, a forbidden but irresistible attraction that neither of them could control. But as the weeks passed, the secrecy and guilt began to take their toll. Jonathan, overwhelmed by his desire and the fear of being discovered, started making reckless decisions. He and Emily would meet in secluded spots around town, completely disregarding the risk of being caught. It was only a matter of time before someone would notice, and in a town like Oak Ridge, secrets were hard to keep. As the affair intensified, Abigail began to sense that something was wrong. Jonathan, once attentive and loving, had become distant and irritable. Emily, who had been so bright and cheerful, was now withdrawn and anxious. Abigail tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong, but the signs were becoming impossible to overlook. On the night of October 14, 2015, Abigail confronted Jonathan about his behavior. They argued late into the night, with Jonathan vehemently denying any wrongdoing. Abigail, exhausted and frustrated, finally dropped the subject, but she knew in her heart that her husband was hiding something. The next day, Abigail decided to leave work early. She wanted to spend time with her children and maybe, just maybe, confront Emily and find out the truth. As she drove home, her mind raced with questions and fears. Little did she know, she was about to uncover a truth far darker than she could have ever imagined. When Abigail walked into her home that afternoon, the house was eerily quiet. She called out for Jonathan and the children, but there was no response. As she moved through the house, her heart began to pound. She reached the back hallway and froze at the sight before her. Emily was there, but so was Jonathan. They were locked in a passionate embrace, completely oblivious to her presence. For a moment, Abigail was paralyzed with shock, unable to process what she was seeing. Then, rage took over. She screamed, startling them both. Jonathan pulled away from Emily, his face pale. Emily, eyes wide with fear, stepped back, stammering apologies. But Abigail wasn't listening. The betrayal, the humiliation, it was too much. She lunged at Jonathan, hitting him, screaming incoherently as tears streamed down her face. Jonathan tried to calm her down, but Abigail was inconsolable. The children, who had been playing outside, ran into the house, drawn by the commotion. They stood frozen in the doorway, watching in horror as their family fell apart. Jonathan finally managed to push Abigail away, but the damage was done. Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with a hatred that chilled him to the bone. "You'll regret this," she hissed, before turning and storming out of the house. That was the last time anyone saw Abigail Carter alive. When Abigail didn't return home that evening, the Oak Ridge Police Department was alerted. Jonathan called 911, his voice trembling as he reported his wife missing. He claimed that they had argued, and Abigail had stormed out of the house around 4 p.m. He insisted he had no idea where she could have gone. Detective Sarah Collins, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for uncovering the truth, was assigned to the case. From the start, something about Jonathan's story didn't sit right with her. His account seemed too rehearsed, his emotions too controlled for a man whose wife had just vanished. The investigation kicked into high gear the following morning. Officers combed through the nearby woods and fields, while others canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen Abigail. But it was as if she had disappeared without a trace. As Detective Collins delved deeper, she learned about the explosive argument between Jonathan, Abigail, and Emily the day before. Emily, visibly shaken when questioned, confirmed that Abigail had caught them in a compromising position and left the house in a fit of rage. She claimed she hadn't seen Abigail since and had no idea where she might be. But something about Emily's demeanor troubled Detective Collins. She seemed too scared, too nervous. It was clear she was hiding something, and Collins was determined to find out what it was. The first major break in the case came 3 days later, on October 18th, when Abigail's car was found abandoned at a remote lookout point about 20 miles outside Oak Ridge. The location was secluded, surrounded by dense woods and steep cliffs. Inside the car, officers found Abigail's purse, phone, and a small overnight bag, but there were no signs of a struggle. The discovery of the car only deepened the mystery. Detective Collins knew that if Abigail had left voluntarily, she would have taken her personal belongings with her. This suggested that something had happened at the lookout point, something sinister. The search around the lookout was extensive. K-9 units scoured the area, but it wasn't until the following day that a volunteer stumbled upon something chilling at the bottom of a ravine. It was Abigail's body, partially covered by leaves and debris, her face bruised and swollen. She had been dead for several days. The autopsy report revealed that Abigail had died from blunt force trauma to the head. She had been struck multiple times with a heavy object, and her hands and arms showed signs of defensive wounds, indicating a violent struggle. There was no doubt this was a murder. Detective Collins now had to determine who was responsible. Her first suspect was Jonathan. His behavior had been erratic, and his alibi for the night of the murder was shaky. He claimed to have spent the evening at home with Emily and the children, but the timeline was fuzzy. Collins interviewed him again, this time pressing him harder. Jonathan maintained his innocence, insisting that he had nothing to do with Abigail's death. He broke down, sobbing, claiming that despite their troubles, he still loved her. But Collins wasn't convinced. She decided to take a closer look at the dynamic between Jonathan and Emily. She reviewed phone records and found dozens of calls and texts between the two in the days leading up to Abigail's death. The messages were cryptic, but one stood out. A text from Jonathan to Emily sent the morning of October 15th, reading, "It's happening today. Be ready." Collins confronted Emily with this information, and under pressure, Emily's composure cracked. She admitted that Jonathan had been acting strange in the days before Abigail's death, talking about wanting to start over and make sure no one got in their way. Emily claimed she didn't know what he meant at the time, but now she feared the worst. With this new information, Collins obtained a warrant to search the Carter home. In the garage, hidden beneath a pile of old tarps, they found a bloody wrench. It matched the type of injuries Abigail had sustained. The blood on the wrench was sent for analysis, and when the results came back, they confirmed what Collins had suspected. It was Abigail's blood. The evidence was damning. Jonathan was arrested and charged with his wife's murder, but even as he sat in custody, the story wasn't over. Emily's involvement was still unclear, and Collins knew that there was more to this twisted tale. During the interrogation, Jonathan finally broke down. He confessed that he had killed Abigail in a fit of rage after she threatened to expose his relationship with Emily. He described how, after Abigail had left the house that afternoon, he had followed her, finding her at the lookout point. They argued again, and when Abigail told him she was going to the police, something inside him snapped. He grabbed the wrench from his car and struck her repeatedly until she collapsed. In a panic, he pushed her body over the edge of the ravine, hoping it would be lost in the dense undergrowth, but despite his confession, there was still one question left unanswered. What role, if any, had Emily played in this horrific crime? With Jonathan's confession in hand, Detective Collins turned her attention back to Emily. The young woman's involvement was still a gray area, and Collins was determined to find out just how deep her connection to this crime went. Emily was brought in for further questioning. She was visibly shaken, her eyes red from crying, but she maintained that she had no knowledge of Jonathan's plans to kill Abigail. However, as Collins laid out the evidence against Jonathan, the text messages, the bloody wrench, his own confession, Emily's facade began to crumble. Collins leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Emily, if you knew anything, now is the time to speak up. Protecting him now could cost you everything." Emily hesitated, her fingers trembling as she wiped away tears. I didn't know he would actually do it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He told me that he was going to talk to her, to try and make things right. I never thought he'd kill her." Collins pressed on. "What about the text message he sent you? It's happening today. Be ready. What did he mean by that?" Emily looked down, guilt and fear etched on her face. "He said he was going to tell her everything, that he wanted to be with me. He told me to be ready to leave with him, that we'd finally be free." Collins's eyes narrowed. "And you believed him?" Emily nodded slowly. "I thought he meant he was going to ask for a divorce. I never wanted this." But as Collins continued to question her, it became clear that Emily wasn't as innocent as she claimed. She had known about Jonathan's intentions to confront Abigail, and while she might not have known that murder was on his mind, she had chosen to stay silent, complicit in the unfolding tragedy. It was then that Collins decided to take a gamble. She presented Emily with a copy of the autopsy report, detailing Abigail's defensive wounds, the brutal nature of her death. "Do you really think he's worth protecting after this?" she asked quietly. "Do you really think he cares about anyone but himself?" Emily broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't know what to do. He said he loved me, that we could be happy together. But when he came back that night, he was covered in blood. I knew something terrible had happened, but I was so scared. He told me to lie, to say that he was with me the whole time. I didn't know what to do." Collins pressed her gently but firmly. "Emily, did you help him in any way? Did you know he was going to kill her?" Emily shook her head vehemently. "No, I swear I didn't know. But when he told me what he'd done, I was afraid. I thought if I said anything, he'd hurt me too. Satisfied that Emily hadn't been directly involved in the murder, but still held some culpability, Collins had her charged with obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. Emily's testimony, combined with Jonathan's confession, painted a complete picture of the crime. On the night of October 14th, after the confrontation with Abigail, Jonathan had made up his mind. He knew that Abigail would never let him go without a fight, and that she would likely expose his affair to the entire town, ruining him. So, he waited until the next day, when he knew she'd be alone, and followed her to the lookout point. When Abigail threatened to go to the police, Jonathan snapped. He had grabbed the wrench from the trunk of his car, a tool he often carried for work, and struck her. The first blow stunned her, and as she fell, he continued hitting her until she stopped moving. Realizing what he had done, he panicked. In a desperate attempt to hide his crime, he pushed her body over the ravine and drove away, thinking no one would ever find her. But his hasty cover-up left too many clues. The blood on the wrench, the surveillance footage, and Emily's hesitant lies all led back to him. Jonathan's downfall was his arrogance and belief that he could control the narrative, but he underestimated the determination of Detective Collins. Jonathan Carter was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His plea for leniency, citing the heat of the moment and his emotional turmoil, fell on deaf ears. The judge, swayed by the brutal nature of the crime and Jonathan's betrayal of his family, showed no mercy. Emily, though spared the worst of the legal repercussions, was forever marked by the crime. She served a brief sentence for her role in covering up the murder, but was ostracized by the community. She left Oak Ridge soon after, trying to rebuild a life shattered by her own choices. In the end, the murder of Abigail Carter wasn't just the result of a forbidden romance gone wrong. It was a tragic culmination of lies, manipulation, and a desperate bid for freedom that spiraled into violence.